listening to the 11th segment of our 12-part series, Healthy Heart, the Wise Woman Way, with Susan Weed at Time Monk Radio. Hello, Susan. Welcome back to Time Monk Radio.
Hi, Gemini. I'm so excited to be back here with you once again and coming toward the end of our 3-month series, Have a Healthy Heart, the Wise Woman Way. And I did want to mention that I do have an online course by the same name. And if these little half-hour weekly sessions that I've been doing with you have piqued your interest, please do come on over to the Wise Woman Bookshop, wisewomanbookshop.com, and you can find out more about my online course. Each week here at Time Monk Radio, I have focused in on one particularly heart-healthy herb. But in my online course, each one of these lessons has 3 herbs that I focus in on. I just don't have time and half an hour to do that. And the wonderful thing about all of my courses is that there's never any time pressure. So you can start it, you can pick it up, you can drop it, you can do it at your own pace, at your own whim, whatever really works for you. So let's move on now. We have spent the past 2 weeks hopefully not miring ourselves too badly in the cholesterol controversy, but seeing that cholesterol is actually a helper and healthy, and statin drugs are not really healthy for the heart, and that there's lots of other choices besides taking statin drugs. At our very first time together, our very first week together when we were looking at a healthy heart, I said that the heart is at the heart of the matter and that it really is influenced by all parts of the body and influences all parts of the body. And so here we are with just 2 weeks left. We better look at some of the other parts of the body that the heart is interactive with. So let's look at the lungs and the kidneys. First of all, the heart is actually surrounded by the lungs. We talk about the heart and the lungs as though they were somehow 2 different things. But when you actually look at them in the chest, you see that the heart and the lungs are one really kind of intimate and closely related tissue, and that the heart is feeding the lungs and the lungs are feeding the heart. So we want to understand that the health of the lungs has something to do with the health of the heart. And again, this is kind of obvious, but it's not maybe immediately obvious. I'll tell you where it became really obvious to me. I had a dear friend, past lover as a matter of fact, who felt that her breathing was not where she wanted it to be. She lived in the Northeast, and she thought, I'm going to move to a dry climate. So she moved to New Mexico. And she thought this would help her breathing, help open it up. She had some allergies and so on. What she didn't know was that the area of New Mexico that she moved to, there was uranium mining. And that uranium mining put radioactive dust into the air, and she breathed that radioactive dust in. And that radioactive dust caused a stress to her lungs, and it actually caused lung cancer to form, even though she'd never been a smoker. And she didn't know about the lung cancer until she had a heart attack. And the stress to her lungs, this is when they found out and told her everything that was going on, the stress to her lungs then in response to the heart attack and the lung cancer was such that when I last saw her, she was getting ready to have a lung transplant. That did not, unfortunately, work for her. But her first clue that something was wrong with her lungs was that she had a heart attack. So let's keep our lungs healthy. Keeping our lungs healthy is part of keeping our heart healthy. My favorite herbs for keeping the lungs healthy are mullein, yarrow, and chickweed. And each of these herbs is an herb that can be used only when we need to take care of our lungs or in a more long-term way. Mullein is just wonderful. It's certainly my top pick for any herb to help the lungs. And I always harvest a lot more mullein than I wind up drinking, for no particular reason, because mullein infusion tastes wonderful. Your classic mullein is called mullein milk. And you make your infusion the regular way. You weigh out 1 ounce of dried mullein, put it in a quart jar, fill the jar to the top with boiling water, put a tight lid on it, and let it sit out for 4 to 10 hours. I just talked to one of my students, and she said, "Oh yes, I've been making the infusions and putting a lid on it, and then putting it in the refrigerator." I said, "Whoa, it's not good for your refrigerator to put boiling liquids in your refrigerator, and I don't know if it's really infusing well if you stick it in the refrigerator." She said, "Oh, well, thought you said to put it in the refrigerator. After it's strained is when we put it in the refrigerator." So we leave our mullein sit out overnight, and then the next day we strain that mullein infusion. We strain it through a cloth because there's hairs in the mullein. And then we can refrigerate that. To make our mullein milk, we're going to add half a milk to our mullein infusion. So we want to make a cup. That would be half a cup of milk and half a cup of mullein infusion. And what my daughter did this past winter, and it was a wonderful winter drink, was she took some spices and she put those spices into the milk. And we were just talking last week about improving heart health by increasing the amount of spices. So she put in cinnamon, and she put in ginger, and she put in some nutmeg, and she infused those spices into the milk before she used the milk, half and half of the mullein. Now, she didn't just make a cup at a time. She was making quarts of this at a time because we simply couldn't get enough of drinking it heated up or cold. Mullein milk, or as she called it, mullein chai, because she mulled the spices in it, is just wonderful. And I think we even published the recipe for it in my e-zine, which is archived. So come and visit me at SusanWeed.com, and you should be able to pull up that recipe. Chickweed is another wonderful herb for the lungs that can be taken on a daily basis if you wish. Yes, you could drink mullein milk or mullein chai every day if that's the way you like to start your day out. It tastes so good. And chickweed tincture, just like the other, chickweed infusion, just like the other infusions, nourishing herbal infusions, can be taken on a regular basis. I don't use chickweed infusion as part of my standard rotation. And possibly I should, because I had viral pneumonia as a child, and so there's probably some decrease in functioning of my lungs. But I certainly have students who make chickweed infusion a regular part of their infusion rounds, especially those who are dealing with issues of weight, because chickweed helps to reduce the size of the fat cells as well as reducing the inflammation throughout the body, and especially in the cardiovascular system. Yay for chickweed. And yarrow is one of my don't leave home without it herbs. Yarrow just does everything. And yarrow, when it comes to the lungs, can really help to open the breathing and help to clear any minor infections that might be going on in the lungs. Yarrow is one of the ingredients in the gypsy lung remedy, often combined with mint and other more soothing herbs like red clover. But yarrow has properties that work throughout the body. It's often thought of as a bladder herb, certainly excellent that way. So I thought of as a wound herb, certainly excellent that way. But let's think of it also as a way to help our lungs. Now, unlike the mullein and the chickweed, we're not going to use yarrow on a daily basis. It's a pretty strong plant. But if you feel that there's any difficulty that might be traced back to an infection, then yarrow is our anti-infection herb for the lungs. The health of the kidneys is also critical to having a healthy cardiovascular system. In fact, the health of the kidneys is probably the most critical thing in the maintenance of a healthy blood pressure. The kidneys, and thus the blood pressure, can be sensitive to table salt. But reducing the amount of salt you put on your food will have very little benefit so long as you're still eating processed foods and eating at restaurants. Reducing the amount of salt in the diet certainly benefits the health of both the heart and the kidneys. The effects of a high-salt diet compared to a low-salt diet show a blood pressure drop comparable to that obtainable from drugs. What are we talking about? Let's get some numbers here. Your average American who is eating out and who's eating processed foods is consuming about 4,000 milligrams of sodium chloride, table salt, on a daily basis. A lower salt diet is between 1,500 and 2,000 milligrams of salt. That's not a low salt diet. We're not talking about eliminating salt, cutting salt out. We're talking about a really moderate change in your diet. But that gives you a blood pressure drop comparable to what you could get from drugs. So don't go overboard about the salt thing. Again, salt your food at the table so long as your food is not processed from a can or you're not at a restaurant. The surest way to reduce the amount of salt in your diet is to cook your meals from scratch. Right? If your meals are cooked at home using wholesome ingredients, then you can put that salt shaker right there on the table and put salt on your food as much as you want, and it's not going to have a detrimental influence on your cardiovascular health. We also know that the kidneys are very important when we are looking at the adrenals. So when we talk about kidneys, we're talking about the kidney adrenal things. Ad means on top of. So the adrenals are on top of the kidneys. So keeping the kidneys healthy is very important to keeping the heart healthy, but so is keeping the adrenals healthy. And my top pick for keeping the kidneys and the adrenals healthy is stinging nettle. What can I say? I adore stinging nettle. It is one of my all-time favorite herbs, and I see to it that I am drinking at least 2 quarts of nettle infusion each and every week. Of all of the infusions that I recommend to people, the one that people really get involved with is usually nettle. Now, my personal story is that I was given a drug as a child for my bladder infections that had as a side effect injuring my kidneys. And by the time I got to be a young adult, my kidneys were not functioning very well. As a matter of fact, this was one of the primary reasons that I began to seek out alternative and integrative medicines, is because I wanted to improve the health of my kidneys. And the modern medical profession simply didn't know how for me to make my kidneys healthier, except not to take this drug that I was being given for bladder infections. Well, there again was a second reason why I became interested in alternative medicine, because they're basically saying there isn't much of anything we can do for your kidneys, but we can tell you that you should stop taking this drug. So then what am I going to do? So as I started to move into my interest in herbs and herbal medicine, stinging nettle came really forward to me and said, I am going to heal your kidneys. Give me a chance and I will heal the kidneys. Now, I use nettle leaf and stalk, the above ground part of the nettle, and I use it strictly before it flowers. Once the nettle has flowered, I'm not interested in using it for infusion anymore. So I do use young stinging nettle. Commercially, however, you can buy stinging nettle in stinging nettle parts. In other words, it's not just the leaf that's for sale. Most of the time, if you go in the store and ask for stinging nettle, they will say use the leaf. But stinging nettle root is also for sale, and stinging nettle seeds are also for sale. And they have pretty important uses as well. Still in all, my experience has been with the leaf, and especially for nourishing the kidneys and the adrenals, I still really like the leaf best. In our next week, we're going to be looking at diabetes, and we're going to be looking at some of the things that have gone on with herbs and diabetes and heart disease. But one of the things that was most interesting to me was a study done in Iran looking at the effects of taking nettle tincture after meals. And there are quite a few reasons why this was especially interesting to me. One was, as I mentioned before, that we often get studies on the herb's active ingredient while not getting studies on the actual herb itself. And this was a study that was actually done on the herb itself. I read about this in Medical Herbalism, the winter 2013-2014 issue, so it's the recent issue, by Paul Bergner, a fabulous herbalist. And the major study was this one done with nettle tincture, and the tincture taken after meals. But then, because he was interested in that, he went and he found actually quite a few other studies, and some of them had actually been done with nettle in a, as he said, an aqueous solution. We would call that nettle infusion. And basically, the results from the study in Iran held true in other forms of nettle. So, many people have heard me say I don't use nettle tincture. I'm going to have to say that that's what they used in this study, and they get glorious results with it. So if you don't, for some reason, like nettle infusion, and I love nettle infusion, then you could indeed use nettle tincture to get these results. This was a double-blind study. They found a double-blind study with a group of obese people who have type 2 diabetes. So this is not just a general healthy population. They're using this in a specific population, a population of people already diagnosed with diabetes, and a population of people who are obese. First of all, they found that the nettle lowered blood levels of glucose and countered insulin resistance. Wow. In fact, their fasting serum glucose levels were very much improved, and their insulin sensitivity was very much improved. But more interesting to us, because we're talking about the heart, have a healthy heart, the wise woman way, is the effect that nettle had on triglyceride levels, and they dropped. They dropped by at least 10%. The HDL rose, and the ratio between LDL and HDL fell from 3.2 to 2.4. That's almost a 30% drop. In the control group, these did not change. The blood sugar levels didn't change. The HDL cholesterol levels didn't change. Triglycerides didn't change. The ratio remained the same. We definitely saw that this was due to insulin because we held other factors in the study steady. And remember back to when we were talking about inflammation and how important it is to counter inflammation if we want to have a healthy heart. Well, They looked at markers of inflammation in this study too, including C-reactive protein, and C-reactive protein fell dramatically in those who were taking the nettle tincture after their meals. And they were taking fairly large doses, 3 to 5 dropperfuls, 3 times a day. The biggest difference was found in those who had the highest initial readings. So in other words, the people who were the most inflamed got the biggest reduction, and that usually makes sense. Right, so a inflammatory or C-reactive protein marker at 3.6 in one of the people was reduced to 1.5. In other words, by more than half, simply by using nettle. Wow, how amazing. All right. The other markers of inflammation that they looked at were inflammatory cytokines, and they fell from 3.5 to 1.1. Again, the control group, no change. Those taking the nettle on a regular basis made more superoxide dismutase, which is an antioxidant enzyme, and their total antioxidant capacity nearly tripled, while the control groups showed, you got it, absolutely no change. Isn't that interesting? I am very thankful that they did this thorough study to really help us understand how the substances, the herbs that we can use to help the kidneys and help the adrenals, how they have such a direct and dramatic impact on heart health as well. Let's just go over making a nettle infusion. I know that you've heard this, but just in case you're just coming to the show right now, we're going to weigh out 1 ounce of dried stinging nettle. We're going to put it into a quart jar. We're going to fill that jar to the top with boiling water, put a tight lid on it, let it sit out on the counter for 4 to 10 hours, and then strain it, squeezing the herb to get all the good out of it, and only after it is brewed, refrigerating the liquid. Nettle infusion is extremely rich in protein, and so we do need to keep it under refrigeration, otherwise it will spoil. And that student that I was talking about, that was why she put it in the refrigerator as soon as she had brewed it, because she was worried about spoilage. That initial sitting out of 4 to 10 hours isn't going to spoil it, but it is why we thereafter do need to keep it refrigerated. Now, I personally find that nettle is a fabulous tasting beverage, but I like my beverages iced. And somebody once served me a cup of hot nettle tea, and I almost spit it out. I thought, oh my goodness. Now I know why some people call this swamp water. If you really want to have your nettle hot, what I'm going to suggest is, rather than putting honey in it, go salty. Put some miso in it. Put some tamari in it. Sprinkle a little salt in it. Make it into a soup. And, hey, it is early summer here in the Catskills, and we are eating nettle soup. We love our nettle soup. And I don't think anybody would want me to put honey in the nettle soup. No, we put, well, astragalus is a good thing in the nettle soup, but mostly what we do is we have a variety of different salty things, because I make the nettle soup without any salt at all. I just boil the nettle right in a big pan of water and serve that up as soup, and then we add the miso to that. Another wonderful, wonderful way to strengthen the kidneys and the adrenals. Let's think about the adrenals just for a minute and kind of think back to last month when we were talking about inflammation. And I said that one of the things that drives inflammation in the body is a raise in cortisone. And cortisone, of course, is made by the adrenals. So when the adrenals are feeling stressed, what happens is that cortisone levels go up. And you remember that when cortisone levels go up, there is a generalized inflammation throughout the body, and blood vessels tend to constrict and get narrower. So when we are using Nettle to help strengthen the kidneys and the adrenals, we are actually having an effect throughout the entire cardiovascular system, throughout the entire hormonal system as well, because the kidneys are also involved in the hormonal system, and the adrenals obviously are very involved in the hormonal system. As we age due to kidney stress, we see that the adrenals have a little harder time making and distributing the hormones as they should. And so I would actually go so far as to say that drinking stinging nettle infusion is like a longevity tonic, because it allows the hormones that are naturally present in our bodies and already made in our bodies to be used far more effectively, because the adrenals are now nourished and working well. And again, remember from last month that hormones play a powerful part in how healthy the heart is. Are you seeing how this just keeps going around and around and tying together, right? We were just talking last week about keeping the liver healthy. And, of course, the liver has to diffuse the hormones that are in the blood. So if the adrenals are stressed and they're making a lot of stress hormones, then what's going to happen is those stress hormones will be in the blood, and the liver has to remove them from the blood. And the better the liver is able to do that, the less stress there's going to be on the blood vessels in the heart, the less oxidation there's going to be of LDL cholesterol. And wow, so we had again drawn in the liver and seeing that it's not that we are a bunch of different city-states that somehow agree. No, we are really a unified whole. And what happens with the kidneys and what happens with the lungs and what happens with the liver has a profound effect on how healthy your heart can be. Next week, we're going to wrap this all up. We're going to see if we can pull all of the threads together, but there's one thread that we haven't gotten involved with at all that we're going to need to bring up, and I'm actually going to introduce it this week because it's a rather large topic and I want a little more time, and that is diabetes. I don't have to tell you that there is a tremendous connection between diabetes and heart attack and stroke. The experts don't agree on how powerful that connection is, but we're talking in powerful, really powerful, or super powerful. We're not talking about powerful or maybe it isn't powerful. One of the first experts that I read said people with diabetes are at least twice as likely to have a heart attack as somebody with normal blood sugar. And then just the other day, I was reading something and it said, people who have diabetes are 5 times more likely to have a heart attack than people who don't. And type 1 diabetes is sometimes called childhood onset diabetes, although that term is rarely used anymore. And type 2 diabetes is often called adult onset diabetes, although, I cringe to have to say it, we are actually finding children with type 2 diabetes now. So what's actually happened in common parlance is that diabetes has come to mean type 2 diabetes. So I want you to know before we get into next week that I'm not going to be talking about type 1 diabetes. It's really quite different than type 2 diabetes, and that's what we're going to be focusing on. We'll wrap this up, and I have my list of some herbs that are often recommended for people with heart conditions that I don't think you should take, as well as just a few other things that you might want to be aware of. Gemini, there goes our time again. Tick, tick, the sands of time. Thank you and everyone there at Time Monk Radio for helping us reclaim herbal medicine as people's medicine.
Thank you, Susan. This completes the 11th segment of our 12-part series, Healthy Heart, the Wise Woman Way, with Susan Weed at Time Monk Radio.